Hello, everyone. Welcome to week one of HUMA 1311. I am excited to get started. Today, we are going to be jumping in, as you hopefully have seen in the syllabus, to talking about Mexican American history. I've tried to, so number one, I'm recording this I have two courses this summer. One is short, 5 weeks, and one is 8 weeks. So I'm trying to break this first lecture up. If you're in the 5-week class, you'll get it in the same week, but two little videos. And if you're in the 8-week class, there'll be two separate videos over 2 weeks. So just to clear that up, if hopefully you don't need to know that, or it all makes sense. But I'm just going to go through today and talk about the kind of beginning early history, the foundations of Mexican American history. Again, this isn't a Mexican American history course. I really encourage you, if you have the time and need the credits, to take our wonderful Mexican American history course offerings at SAC. Dr. Ramos and Dr. Bueno really do a wonderful job of engaging this history, which I think, we'll all talk about that more in a second, but they really engage the history and make it exciting. So if you have that time, I'm not sure if they offer it online, but if you need a history credit, please dig deeper. We will not do it justice because we are just focused on primarily art in this course. But I think we need to know the foundations, right? We need to know the context in which art is made. That's our main goal, is understanding how, for this one cultural group, for Mexican Americans, art has been a pivotal, important practice and means of expressing identity, expressing experience. So we're just going to sort of talk about, in this video, the first part of that history up until the mid-20th century, kind of, the first 100 years or so as Mexican Americans, but a longer history before that. I think one thing I will say as well now is that the context in which we're talking about this is really important for us today in 2023. Increasingly in the last years, before and after, during COVID, there has been a lot of contention, a lot of conflict in the United States about talking about these histories, sort of the history of oppressed communities like Mexican Americans or African Americans, Native Americans, right? LGBTQ communities, all these communities that continue to be marginalized in our society don't necessarily have and haven't historically been centered in our history courses that you might go through in high school, public or private high school. And lawmakers, have really politicized this in an interesting kind of regressive way recently. So it can be actually good to know that there's a context in which we're talking about this, that, actively in the news in Texas, Republican lawmakers are trying to ban these types of courses, prevent people from talking about these histories and these topics, and they kind of fall under the kind of academic category of ethnic studies. So these ethnic groups being able to study their history and their cultural experiences. So do with that knowledge what you will. I think it's important. It kind of gives it more weight for me as an ethnic studies professor, focused on art. And we'll talk about a little bit about like how identity plays a part in that, right? And these narratives, and then the narratives that we see expressed in the art that we're looking at. I think it's important to start to talk about identity in general, right? I like to mention this because I don't want anyone to feel like they have to conform to any kind of identity, whether you're Mexican American or not, and especially if you maybe are kind of genetically, or historically your family is Mexican American. However you identify, right, is up to you. Identities are complex, and they reflect your personal experience, right? How you think of yourself and and you are changing, you're in flux based on where you are and when you are. So how you think of yourself might be different than your grandparents or great-grandparents, because we're part of this ongoing flow of life, right? We're always adapting and changing, and what was true in the past might still be true a little, but it's different now, and it will be different in generations to come. So I don't want to talk about identity as this is blank, right? This is what it means to be Mexican American. In fact, it means an infinite amount of things. But it is possible to talk about the kind of patterns of history and cultural practices. So we're just kind of trying to see it, right? We're trying to, as people interested in art, trying to observe what is, and not necessarily have a judgment about it. So I'm just going to jump in. I think I want to just hit a few periods of time in this video that are critically important to understanding the foundations of what it means to be Mexican American, and that kind of cultural intersection that group of people, my group of people, exists in. And I think the really kind of primary one that I like to begin with is this experience of colonization. Or this first experience. We'll talk about another one, but the first experience of colonization that kind of gave birth to Mexico, at least, right? So one half of that hyphen of this course, Mexican American. This idea of Mexico is based in a really long indigenous history, number one. So, we're talking in many ways about cultures that have stemmed off from one of the dominant groups at the time when Spanish arrived. And hopefully you have a basic understanding historically of that the Spanish did arrive. So one group was the Mexica. They were a Nahua group. So Nahua were the larger indigenous culture with many different groups. And the sort of ruling group at the time of the arrival of the Spanish in 1519, were the Nahua, which sometimes now are called the Aztec. But they called themselves the Mexica. They were Nahua people, and they ruled, as one among many cultures, indigenous cultures in Mexico at the time, in an alliance with other groups. They had this massive sort of empire that came into contact with the Spanish. So the Spanish, as you might know, had begun to explore as a way to kind of build their own empire, their own kingdom, which was relatively new actually at that moment in 1492 when they arrived in the islands, but eventually in the 1519 when they got to the continent of Mexico, what is now Mexico. So again, glossing over so much, right? There not only was an immense thousands of year long history of indigenous people in this land, on Turtle Island. There was, there's such a depth we could get to about colonization, both that initial meeting of these two cultures that didn't know each other existed, and then the ongoing life of being a colony to Spain for 300 years. So, older than the United States, even this moment. Nueva España, the Spanish colony, kind of really created new cultural norms and categories that didn't exist, right? So, the Spanish brought their own cultural structures to this land. They're kind of culturally still relatively, medieval European, and very much Catholic. Sort of politically and culturally Catholic in how they structured their lives and their societies. It's important to know as well that the Spanish, what we think of as Spain, had for the last 800 years before they arrived to the New World, been in this kind of war with the Moors, with Muslims of North Africa, who had ruled that land for 800 years after the birth of Islam, and really brought their own cultural institutions and conflicts and categories to the land, to the Iberian Peninsula in Western England, Europe. um, so the Spanish, had just reunified their country. They had just kind of kicked out the Moors from their land. And that is the moment, right, where they sought to grow, sought to expand, sought to find new ways to the goods and resources of Asia, which were being blocked off for other reasons related to the Ottoman Empire. So they brought as well, right, those experiences of being in a diverse society of Muslims and Jews, Europeans. Spain itself is made of multiple different cultures and languages, like Catalan, etc. And they brought that and kind of took those ideas of experiences of life and put them on life here on the new land with indigenous people. So there became this hierarchy, right? In many ways, kind of equating indigenous people with their previous sort of enemies, right, of the Muslims. As savage, the brown person being a savage, uneducated. They really were wrestling with this, and they expressed it in this hierarchy of who was considered, acceptable as a citizen, as a, normal person versus lower class or outcasts. So, right, the more, as you might know, the more kind of European ancestrally that you were in this colony, the more power and possibility you could have in life. So, for 300 years, 1521 to 1821, this was the kind of new norm. That's the kind of foundation of the Mexican American experience, this new norm that kind of happened quickly at first and then slowly kind of seeped into the culture for hundreds of years. Were indigenous, or mestizo, meaning mixed Spanish and indigenous blood, were less valued than pure blood Spanish European. And we can probably see how this might continue to be important today, and these ideas are still relevant. Jumping ahead, though, the kind of next important moment is the sort of end of the colony, as these white kind of European elites of the colony began to call for independence from Spain, from the king and queen, just like in the American Revolution. After 10 years of war, they were able to gain it in 1821. That was the birth, right, of the nation of Mexico. They chose that name, right? And now the ruling classes didn't have to answer to Spain, but that kind of didn't apply, right, to the majority of Mexican citizens who were poor, rural, or indigenous still kind of maintaining those life practices. But now, there was this new sort of nationhood, being Mexican. And really for us, for this video, the kind of most important moment, the birth of this identity of Mexican-American, is the Mexican-American War. So that birth of Mexico brought opening of trade routes with this new country of the United States above them, right? Land deals to Anglo settlers from the southern United States. But unfortunately, there was a backlash, right? The settlers, Anglo settlers, never intended to become citizens of Mexico, which had very strict kind of anti-slavery laws. Many of these settlers, had slaves and sought to build up their wealth, their economy. So they sought to take that land for themselves, of northern Mexico, this land that was pretty sparsely populated. There were, definitely Mexican citizens there, but there was a lot of space, right? And this war, which again, please watch this video, really goes in depth in an interesting way on the war. But for our purposes, the war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, this deal that was made to end the war that meant that about half of the country of Mexico, half of the land territory, was bought by the United States. So what we now think of as Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, the southwestern United States, was bought in this moment, 1848. To me, that was, for many, that's the birth, right, of this Mexican American identity, of this border that we are now so is now under such contestation and conflict. So again, really, I'm glossing over so much here. You can imagine just this sort of experience in this moment, and of someone who perhaps you could have been young when Mexico was born in the 1820s, and then by the time you're in your midlife, you were now American, right? Your land was now sort of taken by the United States, and all of the cultural issues and social issues that began to stem from that one event. So, as we get into the end of the 1800s, U.S. settlers are expanding west, right? Thinking, these sort of depictions of the cowboys moving west, settlers, colonists moving that way. They're moving into indigenous, but definitely Mexican American communities that were struggling to keep their rights and struggling to deal with this new reality, which is, the border crossed them, that now they're minorities instead of citizens, majority citizens in Mexico, they're minority citizens of the US, and having to deal with increased oppression, as well as assimilation, having a new culture to be oriented towards, and to try to become a part of. But the reality is that many Mexican Americans lived in poverty, or were working class. So I'm going to kind of end there. Again, this is the kind of beginning history, the first, thinking of the first few hundred years of the colony, and then, the period right after it was taken over by the United States. These are these pivotal moments and realities that we can still see in Mexican American culture as the foundation of the culture. And then I'm sure I'm going to come back to often as we look through, paintings and art that expresses these realities, trying to sift through, what does it mean to be in the borderlands, right? What does it mean to be, as many Mexican Americans express, neither here nor there, not feeling at home in the United States or in Mexico, or feeling at home, but perhaps feeling the pull of the other culture. So just feeling that in-betweenness, I think is fascinating, perhaps stressful, and in day-to-day life, confusing, I know for myself, trying to figure out how to be. But at least we know the strands, right? What are the threads of history coming from Europe, coming from indigenous cultures, which again are in themselves incredibly vast. I'm in no way saying that all Mexicans, right, are, descendant from the Nahua, from Mexica. That was just one of the rulers, right, of that moment. I know my family was not indigenous to that area. We were further north. So again, we're starting to get a sense of that diversity, that complexity of identity. That's kind of the main takeaway that I'm trying to get here, is that, one answer to this question, what does it mean to be Mexican American? A lot of different things, right? So with that, I will leave you with this short video, and I hope you're doing well. I'm excited to continue getting this history foundation in this first couple of weeks, before we jump into talking about art. I hope you all have a good week. I'll talk to you soon. Saludos.